They weren't born monsters. They were students, siblings, kids who should have been worrying about homework, not homicide. Every one of these teenagers made a single decision that erased their future, and in most cases, guaranteed they would never walk free again. And what makes these cases terrifying isn't the violence. It's how ordinary they looked before everything broke. Quiet neighborhoods, normal families, no warning signs anyone wanted to see. Some acted out of obsession, some out of rage, some because fantasy completely replaced reality, and some because they believed there was no other way out. But here's the question no court transcript ever fully answers. At what point does a child stop being a child? In the eyes of the law, these teens crossed that line forever. Charged as adults, sentenced like hardened criminals, and locked away for decades or for life. One bad choice can outlive childhood. Over the next hour, we're going to walk through 10 true cases where adolescents collided with irreversible violence. Not rumors, not internet myths, real crimes, real victims, real sentences that don't come with second chances. And as each story unfolds, one truth becomes harder to ignore. The most dangerous moment isn't when someone snaps. It's when everyone assumes they never could. This is 10 evil teens who will never leave prison. Chapter 1. Claire Miller. At first, the neighborhood didn't have a story to tell. No police tape on the street corners, no whispers of trouble, no history that made anyone say, "Yeah, that family always seemed off." It was the kind of suburban calm where people wave from driveways, where headlines feel like something that happens somewhere else. And then, in the early hours of one winter night in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a teenager picked up a phone and said words that would rip that illusion apart. Not a scream, not a frantic plea, a confession. Because the most chilling part isn't what she admitted, it's how calmly the morning began. Claire Miller was 14. 14 is still an age of half-finished identities, old enough to want independence, young enough to still be treated like a child in most homes. Neighbors described her as polite, quiet, even cheerful in the way some teens can be when they're not trying too hard to be noticed. To the outside world, she wasn't the kid you'd circle in a yearbook and label danger. Her home didn't look like a crime scene waiting to happen. It looked like a family. But inside that home was a dynamic that shaped everything. Claire had an older sister, Helen. Helen lived with cerebral palsy and depended on daily care. The details mattered because in families like this, routines become the backbone of survival. Wheelchair access, medication schedules, help with basic tasks. The kind of caregiving that demands patience, time, and constant attention. And the community saw that devotion. People knew Helen. People knew the family tried. That's what made what happened next feel impossible to process. Just after 1 a.m., Claire called 911. When police arrived, they found her outside the house, still in pajamas, standing in the cold like someone waiting for a ride that would never come. According to reports, she directed officers inside, and in Helen's room, they discovered Helen unresponsive. The attempt to save her didn't change the outcome, and suddenly, the same girl who would have been worrying about school assignments or social drama was being put into handcuffs on the front lawn. So the question became immediate and brutal. Why would a 14-year-old do this? In cases like this, people rush towards simple explanations because complicated ones are hard to live with. Was it a secret history of abuse? A hidden family feud? Some online influence? A bad kid who finally showed her true self? Investigators looked for what they always look for: patterns. But early on, there didn't appear to be the kind of obvious trail the public expects. No long rap sheet, no public history of violence, nothing that neatly turned a suburban teen into a headline. And that's the part that unsettles people most. Because if there was no obvious buildup, then it forces everyone to face a terrifying possibility that sometimes catastrophe isn't preceded by a siren. Sometimes it arrives quietly, from the inside, and by the time anyone notices, it's already over. As the investigation moved forward, another dimension took center stage: Claire's mental state. Discussions of anxiety, depression, and emotional instability began to surface. And whether or not the public heard every clinical detail, the legal system had to address the same issue every time a young person commits a serious crime. How do you measure accountability when the defendant is still developing? Emotionally, psychologically, neurologically? Here's where Pennsylvania law added an extra layer of shock. In many situations involving homicide, juveniles can be charged as adults. That doesn't mean the court ignores age, but it does mean the process becomes far more severe, far more public, and far more unforgiving. Claire wasn't treated like a kid who made a terrible mistake. She was treated like a person accused of murder. Camera flashes, courtroom doors, reporters asking why, as if a single sentence could explain the collapse of a family. And through it all, the public watched a contradiction play out. Her small frame, her young face, paired with charges that typically belong to hardened offenders. But the courtroom fight wasn't just about punishment. It was about where she would live and who she would become if she survived the system. On one side, prosecutors emphasized the seriousness of what happened. A life had been taken. The victim was vulnerable. The act was intentional. In their view, the gravity demanded consequences that matched the harm. On the other side, the defense argued that her youth mattered, not as an excuse, but as a reality. 14-year-olds are not adults. Their impulse control is different. Their ability to foresee consequences is different. And when mental illness becomes part of the conversation, the entire framework shifts from evil to broken. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Both sides can be right in different ways. A person can be sick and still cause irreversible harm. A person can be young and still make a decision that destroys everything. This is where the case began to spark debate beyond the county. Because people don't just react to the crime, they react to the idea of what it means. Parents saw their own kids in Claire's age. Siblings saw their own family dynamics in the caregiving burden. Advocates for people with disabilities mourned Helen not just as a victim, but as a reminder of how dependent some people are on those closest to them, and how vulnerable that dependence can be. The safest place can become the most dangerous. As months turned into years, evaluations and court motions shaped the outcome. Competency, mental health treatment needs, where she should be housed, whether she could be rehabilitated, whether the system even has a real plan for a child inside an adult process. And then, the case reached a conclusion that, to many, felt like a grim compromise between punishment and diagnosis. In March 2023, Claire Miller pleaded guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder in Helen's death. That phrase, guilty but mentally ill, often confuses the public because it sounds like a contradiction. It isn't. It's a legal category meant to say, the defendant committed the act, bears responsibility in the eyes of the court, and also requires treatment for mental health issues. It doesn't erase guilt. It doesn't erase consequences. It adds a clinical reality to the legal one. The sentence that followed was severe, 12.5 to 40 years in prison, with mental health treatment ordered as part of incarceration, which means even in the best-case scenario, her life is measured in decades behind bars. And that's what makes this story so haunting. Nobody wins. The Miller family lost Helen, a young woman who already lived with daily challenges, who relied on care and protection, whose life ended in the place she should have been safest. And the same family had to face another impossible reality. Their younger daughter would now be known nationally as the person responsible. Communities struggle with crimes like this because they don't fit into an easy moral frame. It's not a stranger in the dark. It's not a criminal mastermind. It's not a clean narrative. It's the collapse of something intimate. It's the shattering of trust inside a home. And it raises questions people don't want to ask out loud. How much pressure can a young mind carry before it fractures? How should the system respond when the offender is also, in some sense, a child in crisis? And what does justice even mean when the victim is family? In the aftermath, the case became another spark in the national debate about juvenile sentencing, especially in extreme crimes. Some argue that teenagers, even when they commit horrific acts, should always be prioritized for rehabilitation. Others argue that certain actions cross a line so permanent that society has to respond with permanent separation. And then there's the quiet group in the middle, the people who look at this case and feel only grief. because the labels don't make the tragedy smaller. But if Chapter was a case rooted in family and mental collapse, the next story will show something even more unsettling. Two children who said they were serving a fictional entity and nearly killed their best friend to prove it. Because sometimes the danger isn't hatred. Sometimes it's belief. Next, the Slender Man stabbing case, when fantasy stopped being pretend. Chapter 2. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier. It started the way so many childhood memories do, on a night that was supposed to be harmless. A sleepover, pizza boxes on the floor, laughter that stretched past bedtime. 3 12-year-old girls in a Wisconsin town, where parents felt safe enough to let kids wander, where danger didn't feel close enough to worry about. And that's what makes this case so disturbing, because nothing about that weekend looked violent. Nothing looked final. But by the end of it, one girl would be left bleeding in the woods, and the other two would calmly explain they did it for something that wasn't real. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier were both 12, old enough to be curious, young enough to still live half inside imagination. They weren't known as bullies. They weren't hardened or reckless. Teachers described them as quiet, creative, and deeply absorbed in their own inner worlds. And in those worlds, something had taken root. Slender Man. An internet creation. A faceless figure born on message boards, built from photoshopped images and collaborative storytelling. To most people, it was just another creepy character. Something to laugh at, maybe shiver at, then move on from. But for Morgan and Anissa, it became something else entirely. Not fiction, not metaphor, not play. They believed Slender Man was real. Not real in the way kids pretend ghosts exist. Real in the way religion exists. Real in the way fear shapes behavior. Real enough to demand obedience. And according to them, obedience required a sacrifice. The third girl at that sleepover was Peyton. She trusted them. She had no reason not to. They were friends, classmates, kids who shared jokes and secrets. What Peyton didn't know was that, for months, Morgan and Anissa had been discussing a plan. Not a vague idea, not a passing thought, a plan to kill her. They believed that if they proved their loyalty, Slender Man would reward them, protect their families, take them to live in his mansion in the woods, and give their lives meaning. Without the sacrifice, they believed something terrible would happen. This is the moment where many people ask the wrong question. They ask, how could kids believe something so ridiculous? The better question is, what happens when a child loses the ability to separate imagination from obligation? Because belief isn't harmless once it starts issuing commands. The morning after the sleepover, the plan moved from fantasy into motion. The girls convinced Peyton to go to a nearby park. From there, they led her deeper into a wooded area, far enough that no one would hear, far enough that help wouldn't come quickly. At some point, Morgan pulled out a knife she had brought from home, and then they attacked. 19 stab wounds. 19 times, a 12-year-old girl was stabbed by the people she trusted most. And what happened next is the only reason this story isn't about a child's death. Peyton survived. Bleeding heavily, barely able to move, she crawled out of the woods. Each movement cost her energy she didn't have. Each breath hurt. And eventually, a passing cyclist saw her and stopped. That moment, random, accidental, saved her life. Doctors later said 2 of the stab wounds narrowly missed vital organs. Minutes mattered. Luck mattered. Survival came down to chance. Sometimes survival depends on being seen. Meanwhile, Morgan and Anissa weren't running from the scene in panic. They weren't hiding. They were walking calmly along a road when police found them. And when officers asked what happened, the girls didn't deny it. They explained it. They spoke about Slender Man, about proving loyalty, about becoming his proxies, about needing to kill their friend so their families wouldn't be harmed. Seasoned detectives listened in disbelief. These weren't rehearsed lies. They weren't evasive answers. They were sincere explanations from children who believed they had done what was required. And that's when the case became more than a crime. It became a psychological earthquake. Because the legal system wasn't built for this. 12-year-olds are typically treated as juveniles. The focus is meant to be rehabilitation, education, protection. But the brutality of what happened forced prosecutors into a decision that would divide the country. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier were charged as adults. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Some argued that the attack was premeditated, organized, and nearly fatal, clear signs of adult-level intent. Others argued that charging children as adults ignored the obvious mental health crisis unfolding in front of everyone. As the case progressed, evaluations revealed a crucial difference between the two girls. Morgan was diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia. Her belief in Slender Man wasn't a phase. It wasn't pretend. It was a delusion, deep, consuming, and untreated. Experts testified that she struggled to distinguish fantasy from reality in a meaningful way. Anissa, on the other hand, did not share the same diagnosis. She understood, on some level, that Slender Man wasn't physically real, but she feared him anyway. She believed that if they didn't act, something worse would happen. She followed Morgan, reinforced the belief, and participated fully in the plan. Which raised a disturbing question. When one child is deeply delusional and another is influenced by fear and loyalty, who is leading and who is responsible? The court ultimately chose a path that tried to balance punishment with treatment. Both girls accepted plea deals. Morgan was sentenced to decades in a secure psychiatric facility, where treatment, not punishment, would define her confinement. Anissa received a shorter sentence, still measured in decades, but with the possibility of supervised release if she could ever be deemed safe. Neither outcome satisfied everyone. Some felt the sentences were too lenient for an attempted murder. Others felt they were too harsh for children whose minds were still forming, and in Morgan's case, profoundly ill. And then there was Peyton. While debates raged in courtrooms and online, she was learning how to walk without pain again, learning how to trust again, learning how to live with the knowledge that her friends had tried to kill her. She later spoke about the emotional damage being as deep as the physical wounds. The betrayal, the confusion, the loss of innocence that no surgery could repair. But the ripple effects of this case went far beyond one town. Parents began asking what their children were consuming online. Educators began questioning how fantasy worlds are discussed, or ignored, in classrooms. Mental health professionals pointed to the case as an example of what happens when warning signs go unnoticed or untreated. Slender Man was never meant to be real. But belief doesn't need reality to be dangerous. It only needs certainty. And certainty, in a developing mind, can be lethal. This case forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. The internet didn't create violence, but it can provide narratives powerful enough to shape behavior when mental illness is present and guidance is absent. Morgan and Anissa didn't wake up one day wanting to be killers. They woke up believing they had no choice. That distinction doesn't erase responsibility, but it changes how we understand it. Today, both remain confined. Their childhoods ended in handcuffs. Their names became shorthand for a moment when fiction crossed into bloodshed. And the woods where it happened? They look ordinary now. Trees grow, paths fade, kids still play nearby. Which might be the most unsettling detail of all. Because the place didn't change, only the lives did. And next, we move to a case where fear, not belief, drove a teenager to make a decision that would haunt an entire neighborhood for decades. A boy left home alone, a younger child knocking on the door, and a secret hidden where no one thought to look. Next, Josh Phillips, and the crime concealed beneath his bed. Chapter 3. Josh Phillips. On the surface, nothing about that afternoon felt dangerous. It was a quiet neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida. The kind of place where kids rode bikes in the street, and parents felt comfortable leaving their doors unlocked. On November 3, 1998, school had just let out, and for most families, the day unfolded like any other. But behind one front door, a chain of decisions was about to begin, each one worse than the last, each one narrowing the path back to safety. And at the center of it all was a 14-year-old boy who was terrified of getting in trouble. Because this wasn't a crime that started with hatred. It started with fear. Josh Phillips lived with his parents in a modest home. Neighbors described him as quiet, shy, and unremarkable. He wasn't known for aggression. He liked baseball. He liked video games. To the outside world, he was just another teenager trying to stay out of trouble. But inside the house, the atmosphere was different. Josh's father was strict, intensely so. According to later testimony, Josh was deeply afraid of punishment. Rules weren't suggestions, they were lines you didn't cross. And if you did, consequences followed. That fear mattered, because on that day, Josh was home alone, and he wasn't supposed to have anyone over. Around mid-afternoon, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton came by the house. She lived nearby, was well-liked in the neighborhood, and was known for being energetic and friendly. She wasn't a stranger. She was a kid looking for someone to play with. She knocked. Josh answered, and instead of sending her away, he let her in. That single decision, small, ordinary, human, set everything else in motion. The two went outside to play baseball. It was casual, innocent, a normal interaction between kids of different ages in a quiet neighborhood. And then the ball hit Maddie in the eye. She cried, loudly, painfully. For Maddie, it was just an accident. For Josh, it felt like the end of the world. In his mind, the sound of her crying wasn't just noise, it was evidence. Evidence that his parents would come home and find out he'd broken the rules. Evidence that punishment was coming. This is the moment where everything could have stopped. He could have walked her home. He could have called for help. He could have admitted what happened. Instead, fear took control. Josh dragged Maddie inside the house. What followed wasn't a single act. It was a series of escalating choices driven by panic. According to his later statements, he tried to quiet her. When that didn't work, he hit her again. Each attempt to stop the situation only made it worse. The line between accident and intent blurred. And by the time Josh realized what was happening, Maddie was fatally injured. Now came the moment that would define this case forever. Instead of calling 911, instead of running to a neighbor, instead of telling the truth, Josh tried to hide what he had done. He took Maddie's body into his bedroom, and he slid her underneath his waterbed. The hardest secrets are the ones you sleep above. For the next 7 days, life went on. That's what makes this case almost unbearable to imagine. While Maddie's family panicked, while volunteers searched the neighborhood, while police canvassed homes and questioned residents, her body was just feet away from Josh every night, under the bed where he slept. The community rallied. Flyers went up. News cameras arrived. Parents hugged their kids tighter. And Josh joined the search. He walked the streets with neighbors. He answered questions. He looked for a girl he knew exactly where to find. It wasn't until a week later that the truth came out, and it wasn't because Josh confessed. Josh's mother went into his room to clean. While making the bed, she noticed something strange. The waterbed was leaking. The mattress sagged in a way it hadn't before. She looked underneath, and the nightmare revealed itself. Police were called immediately. Officers arrived and confirmed the unimaginable. Within hours, Josh Phillips was arrested. The shock was total. Parents in the neighborhood couldn't process it. Maddie's family was shattered, and the media descended on Jacksonville with a story that felt too horrific to be real. A 14-year-old boy, an 8-year-old girl, a secret hidden in plain sight. Because of the severity of the crime, Josh was charged as an adult with first-degree murder. That decision alone ignited national debate. Could a child truly understand the consequences of such actions? Or was this the tragic outcome of fear compounded by immaturity and a lack of guidance? At trial, the defense argued that Josh hadn't planned to kill Maddie. They described him as a frightened child who panicked and made a series of terrible decisions. They emphasized his fear of his father and the environment of discipline he lived under. The prosecution told a different story. They focused on what happened after the killing. The concealment, the deception, the fact that he lived with the body for days and participated in the search. To them, this wasn't just panic, it was calculated behavior. The jury had to decide which version mattered more, the fear of a child or the actions of someone who hid the truth while a community searched in agony. In 1999, Josh Phillips was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory, life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 15 years old, Josh entered the adult prison system. His childhood ended not with graduation, but with the cell door closing. The reaction was deeply divided. Some believed justice had been served, that the brutality of the crime and the prolonged concealment demanded the harshest punishment. Others argued that sentencing a teenager to die in prison ignored the developmental reality of adolescence. Years later, the law shifted. Supreme Court rulings changed how life sentences for juveniles could be applied. In 2017, Josh was granted a resentencing hearing. His punishment was reduced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, which meant something almost unthinkable. One day, he might be released. For Maddie's family, that possibility reopened wounds that never fully healed. For reform advocates, it represented progress, acknowledgement that children, even when they commit horrific crimes, are not the same as adults. Josh remains incarcerated. His parole eligibility does not guarantee freedom. It only allows for the question to be asked. Has he changed? Does remorse matter? Can rehabilitation ever balance what was lost? And that's where this case lingers, in the space between fear and responsibility. Because Josh Phillips didn't set out to kill someone that day, but he made choices that ensured the damage could never be undone. This story is often cited in discussions about juvenile justice reform, not because it offers clear answers, but because it exposes how fragile the line can be between a bad decision and a life sentence. Maddie Clifton is remembered as a bright, playful child whose life ended far too soon. Her name appears in articles, documentaries, and legal debates, but behind every mention is a family that never got to watch her grow up. And Josh Phillips? He is remembered as the boy who hid a body under his bed, a phrase so disturbing it has become shorthand for the case itself. Which raises a final, uncomfortable question. If fear can drive a child to do this, what happens when fear meets jealousy, or obsession, or betrayal? Next, we move to a case where friendship turned into a death sentence, planned months in advance by the people a girl trusted most. Next chapter, Skylar Neese and the betrayal that shocked West Virginia.
Chapter 4. Rachel Schoaf and Sheila Eddy.
The night Skylar Neese disappeared, nothing felt urgent at first. Her parents believed what many parents believe when a teenager doesn't come home on time. That she'd gone out with friends, maybe broken curfew, maybe needed space. Skylar was 16, independent, social. She had friends she trusted, friends she'd known for years. No one imagined that those same friends were the reason she wouldn't be coming back. Because the most terrifying part of this case isn't how Skylar died. It's how long the killers pretended nothing happened. Skylar Neese lived in Star City, West Virginia, a small town where people knew each other's routines. She was bright, outspoken, and ambitious. Teachers described her as sharp and driven. She talked about becoming a lawyer one day. She had plans, direction, a future that extended far beyond the town she grew up in. Her closest friends were Rachel Schoaf and Sheila Eddy. The three girls were inseparable, or at least that's how it looked. They went to the same school. They shared inside jokes, selfies, late-night conversations. Parents saw them as a tight-knit trio, the kind of friendship that feels unbreakable at that age. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Rachel and Sheila had grown closer to each other, leaving Skylar increasingly on the outside. Text messages later revealed resentment, jealousy, a sense that Skylar was no longer welcome in a friendship she thought was permanent. And instead of drifting apart, Rachel and Sheila made a decision that defies logic. They decided Skylar had to die. Not in a moment of rage, not during an argument. They planned it. On July 6, 2012, Rachel and Sheila asked Skylar to sneak out with them. It wasn't unusual. Skylar climbed out of her bedroom window, believing she was meeting friends for a late-night drive. That was the last time her parents saw her alive. The girls drove across state lines into Pennsylvania, to a remote wooded area far from houses, far from help. Somewhere along that dark stretch of road, Skylar must have realized something was wrong. But by then, there was no turning back. They parked. They walked into the woods. And then, according to later testimony, Rachel and Sheila counted. 1, 2, 3. And they stabbed her. Over and over. Skylar fought back. Investigators later said she struggled fiercely, refusing to go quietly. But she was outnumbered, outmatched, and in the darkness, her resistance wasn't enough. After it was over, they tried to bury her. The ground was too hard, so they covered her body with branches and leaves and left her there, alone in the woods. Then they drove home and went on with their lives. The next morning, Skylar's parents panicked. She hadn't come home. Her phone went unanswered. Hours passed. then days. Police initially considered the possibility that she'd run away. It's a common assumption with missing teens, and it would later become one of the most painful aspects of the case. Her parents insisted something was wrong, that Skylar wouldn't leave without telling them. Rachel and Sheila played their roles perfectly. They cried. They posted messages online about missing their best friend. They comforted Skylar's parents. Sheila even tweeted about her grief. Public displays of sorrow that would later be replayed in court as evidence of chilling deception. The town searched, posters went up, media attention grew, and all the while, the people responsible were right there, blending into the crowd. The most convincing masks are worn closest to the truth. Months passed with no answers. Then, Rachel began to crack. The weight of what they'd done, the constant lying, the attention, it became too much. In December 2012, Rachel suffered a breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Shortly after, she confessed. Her statement stunned investigators. She described how she and Sheila had planned Skylar's murder for months, how they lured her out, how they crossed state lines, how they carried out the attack together. And then, she offered to take police to the body. In January 2013, nearly 6 months after Skylar disappeared, investigators followed Rachel into the woods. There, they found Skylar Neese's remains. For her parents, it was devastating confirmation of what they'd feared all along. Their daughter hadn't run away. She had been murdered by the people she trusted most. The legal process moved quickly after that. Rachel Schoaf agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors. In exchange for her testimony against Sheila Eddy, she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Sheila Eddy, on the other hand, refused to cooperate. She denied involvement until the evidence became overwhelming. Text messages, Rachel's confession, timelines that couldn't be explained away. Facing trial, Sheila eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Her sentence? Life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The courtroom reactions were raw. Skylar's parents spoke about the betrayal, about welcoming these girls into their home, about trusting them with their daughter's life. No sentence could bring Skylar back, but the convictions answered the question that had haunted the town for months. Who did this? And the answer was more frightening than any stranger story could have been. It wasn't an outsider. It was friendship. The case sent shockwaves far beyond West Virginia. People struggled to understand how teenage jealousy could escalate into something so calculated. Psychologists analyzed the dynamics. Media outlets called it a real-life cautionary tale about exclusion, obsession, and cruelty. But perhaps the most lasting impact came in the form of change. Skylar's parents pushed for reform, arguing that the initial assumption that Skylar was a runaway had delayed the urgency of the investigation. Their advocacy led to the passage of Skylar's Law in West Virginia, which requires Amber Alerts to be issued even if authorities believe a missing child may have left voluntarily. Her legacy became protection for others. Rachel and Sheila grew into adults behind bars. Their teenage years ended in prison uniforms. Their futures collapsed into visiting hours and parole hearings. Whatever they imagined their lives would be at 16 was erased the night they chose violence. And Skylar? She is remembered not for how she died, but for who she was. Smart, determined, and deeply loved. Her story forces a painful reflection. Teenagers are often warned about strangers, about dark alleys, about people they don't know. But Skylar's case teaches a different lesson. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't outside the circle, it's inside it. Friendship, when twisted by resentment and exclusion, can become something lethal. And that's what makes this chapter so hard to shake. Because it asks a question that doesn't have an easy answer. How do you protect yourself from the people you trust most? Next, we move from betrayal to obsession, inside a high school hallway where rejection, jealousy, and a stolen gun collided in seconds. A single shot, a school frozen in fear, and a teenage friendship that ended in blood. Next chapter, Tia Wimberly and the murder that stunned a Florida high school.
Chapter 5. Tia Wimberly.
The hallways were loud that morning. Lockers slammed, shoes squeaked against tile. conversations overlapped in the way they always do between classes. At Dillard High School in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, November 12, 2008, began like hundreds of other school days before it. No alarms, no warnings, no sense that anything was about to go terribly wrong. And that's what makes what happened next so haunting. Because the violence didn't come from outside the school. It came from inside a friendship. Tia Wimberly was 15 years old. To most of her classmates, she was outgoing, athletic, and popular. She played in the marching band. She laughed easily. She blended in. There was nothing about her that suggested she would one day become the center of a national tragedy. Her closest bond was with another student, Amanda Collette. At first, their friendship looked intense but ordinary, the kind of closeness teenagers often form when they feel seen by someone else. They spent hours together. They shared secrets. They leaned on each other in a way that felt exclusive and deeply personal. But over time, the dynamic shifted. Tia developed romantic feelings for Amanda. Amanda did not feel the same way. That imbalance changed everything. For Amanda, the boundary was clear. She wanted friendship, not romance. For Tia, the rejection wasn't just painful, it felt like abandonment. Like losing the one person who mattered most. And instead of fading, that feeling grew sharper. Friends later said Tia struggled emotionally in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Jealousy, fear of losing Amanda, anger at the idea that their connection might not be mutual. These emotions didn't explode outward, they turned inward, quietly building pressure. And then, she made a decision that couldn't be undone. Tia took her mother's handgun from home. She hid it. She carried it with her. She brought it into school. That single act transformed private pain into public danger. During a passing period between classes, Tia confronted Amanda in the hallway. Witnesses later said the exchange looked calm at first. No shouting, no dramatic argument. Just two teenagers talking, close enough that no one thought to intervene. And then Tia pulled out the gun. One shot. Amanda collapsed to the floor. The hallway erupted into chaos. Students screamed. Some ran. Others froze. Teachers rushed toward the sound without knowing what they'd face. Amanda died from the gunshot wound. Her life ended in the place she should have been safest, surrounded by peers, under the watch of adults meant to protect her. Tia didn't continue firing. She didn't turn the gun on anyone else. Instead, she left the building. Moments later, she called 911. She told the operator what she had done. Police found her nearby and arrested her without resistance. It only took 1 second to erase everything. The community was stunned. A 15-year-old girl had brought a gun into school and killed another student. Someone she knew, someone she cared about. Vigils were held almost immediately. Classrooms fell silent. Students struggled to process the reality that a normal school day had ended in death. Amanda Collette was remembered as kind, bright, and full of promise. Friends described her as warm and genuine. Teachers spoke of her potential. And suddenly, her future was gone. As the legal process began, the central question wasn't whether Tia had fired the gun. She had admitted it. The question was how the system would respond. Because at 15, Tia sat in a space between childhood and adulthood, and the law had to decide which side mattered more. Prosecutors argued that the act was deliberate. Tia had taken a firearm from home. She had brought it to school. She had confronted Amanda with it. In their view, these steps showed intent, planning, and awareness. They pushed for adult charges. The defense painted a different picture. They described Tia as a deeply emotional teenager overwhelmed by rejection and fear of loss. They emphasized that she had no criminal history, that she surrendered immediately, and that her actions were the result of emotional collapse, not malice. They argued that her age mattered, that her brain was still developing, that her ability to regulate emotion was not the same as an adult's. The courtroom became a battleground between two realities, a child in pain and a life taken. In 2009, Tia was charged and later convicted of second-degree murder. Her sentence? 25 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. She would spend her youth behind bars. Because of her age, Tia was initially placed in a correctional facility for youthful offenders. But that protection was temporary. Eventually, she would be transferred into the adult prison system. Her teenage years, proms, graduations, first jobs, would happen without her. The reaction to the sentence was deeply divided.
Some believed it was just. A young girl was dead. A gun had been brought into a school. Anything less felt like minimizing the danger. Others felt the punishment ignored the emotional complexity of adolescence. They argued that TH's actions, while horrific, came from a place of instability and heartbreak, not predatory intent. The case became part of a broader conversation about school violence. Not mass shootings, not random attacks, but targeted violence born from personal relationships. Because this wasn't about ideology or notoriety, it was about rejection. And rejection, in a teenage mind, can feel catastrophic. Dillard High School never fully returned to normal. Students who were there that day carried the memory forward. Some with fear, others with guilt, others with anger. Teachers spoke openly about how the sense of safety had been permanently altered. Amanda's classmates graduated without her. Her seat remained empty in photos and memories. Meanwhile, Tia grew older inside prison walls. Whatever version of herself existed before that hallway confrontation was replaced by inmate numbers and scheduled movements. The intensity of teenage emotion was replaced by the reality of long-term incarceration. Her case is often cited in discussions about warning signs, how emotional distress in young people can escalate if left unaddressed, how access to firearms transforms impulsive thoughts into irreversible acts. Unchecked emotion becomes a loaded weapon. This chapter isn't about excusing what happened. It's about understanding how quickly emotional pain can spiral when combined with access, isolation, and immaturity. Tia didn't wake up that morning planning to destroy a school. She woke up hurting. But pain, when left unmanaged, can become dangerous. And that's the lesson many take from this case. Not that teenagers are inherently violent, but that they are vulnerable to extremes when they don't have the tools to cope. Amanda Collette lost her life to a moment that lasted seconds. Her family lost a daughter. Her friends lost a future they expected to share. And a school lost the illusion that tragedy only comes from strangers. Next, we step back in time to a case that shocked the entire nation, long before school shootings became a grim pattern. A teenage girl, a rifle, an elementary school playground, and a sentence that echoed around the world. I don't like Mondays. Next chapter, Brenda Spencer and the shooting that changed how America viewed school violence. Chapter 6. Brenda Spencer. The children were waiting for the bell. It was a cold January morning in San Diego, and students gathered outside Cleveland Elementary School the way they always did, talking, laughing, running in short bursts of energy before class. Teachers stood nearby, watching over them, ready to usher everyone inside. Across the street, in a small house facing the playground, a 16-year-old girl opened her bedroom window. She raised a rifle, and without warning, she began to shoot. Because sometimes, history doesn't announce itself with chaos at first. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet click, and then, everything changes. Brenda Spencer lived directly across from the school. From her window, the playground was clearly visible. Neighbors later described her as withdrawn and isolated, a teenager who kept to herself and rarely seemed happy. She struggled in school, had few close friends, and carried a heaviness that adults around her didn't fully understand or didn't know how to address. Her family life was unstable. Her parents were divorced. She lived with her father in a small, cluttered home. According to later accounts, the relationship was strained, marked by neglect and emotional distance. Just weeks earlier, Brenda's father had given her a Christmas gift that would soon become infamous: a .22 caliber rifle, a scope, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. It was not given as a joke, not as a decoration. It was treated as ordinary, acceptable, harmless. On the morning of January 29, 1979, Brenda positioned herself at the window and began firing at the children below. Panic exploded across the playground. Kids screamed and ran. Some dropped to the ground. Teachers shouted, trying to pull students to safety. In the chaos, two adults did what instinct demanded. They moved toward danger instead of away from it. The school's principal and custodian rushed outside to protect the children. Both were shot and killed. 8 children were wounded. A police officer responding to the scene was also injured. What followed was a standoff that lasted hours. Police surrounded the house. Streets were blocked off. Parents waited in terror, unsure whether their children were safe. Negotiators tried to make contact. Brenda stayed inside. At one point, she spoke to a reporter by phone. When asked why she was shooting at school children, she gave a response so cold and casual, it would echo through history. "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." Indifference can be more terrifying than rage. The phrase spread instantly. Newspapers printed it. Broadcasters repeated it. People struggled to reconcile the words with the images of wounded children and grieving families. After nearly 7 hours, Brenda surrendered. She walked out of the house and was taken into custody without further violence. Inside, police found shell casings scattered across her bedroom floor, evidence of how methodically she had fired. The nation was stunned. At the time, school shootings were not a regular headline. There was no template for understanding what had just happened. No framework for explaining why a teenager would target an elementary school playground. And the question everyone asked was the same. Why? The legal system moved quickly and decisively. Despite being just 16 years old, Brenda was charged as an adult. The severity of the crime left little room for leniency in the eyes of prosecutors. 2 people were dead. Children had been wounded. The attack was deliberate. In 1980, Brenda pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon. The sentence? Life in prison, with a possibility of parole after 25 years. At 16, her future collapsed into a prison number. The court proceedings revealed more about Brenda's life, but none of it offered a simple explanation. She claimed to have been abused. She spoke of depression. She described feeling isolated and angry. Mental health professionals weighed in, but no diagnosis fully accounted for the scale of the violence. And that's what unsettled people. There was no manifesto, no ideological motive, no clear target beyond proximity, just access to a weapon, emotional emptiness, and an opportunity. The community around Cleveland Elementary School was devastated. Parents questioned how something like this could happen without warning. Teachers carried guilt they would never fully shake, replaying moments, wondering if they'd missed signs. Children who survived carried the trauma forward, many struggling for years with fear, anxiety, and the loss of innocence. Over time, Brenda Spencer's name became shorthand for something larger. She was one of the first widely publicized school shooters in American history. Her actions forced the country to confront a reality it hadn't yet faced: that violence could erupt in schools without warning, without clear motive, and without external threats. Her infamous phrase took on a life of its own. It was referenced in music, culture, and commentary. Some criticized the attention, arguing it glamorized the shooter rather than honoring the victims. Others saw it as a grim reminder of how detached someone could be from the suffering they caused. In prison, Brenda's behavior remained complicated. She applied for parole multiple times over the decades. Each time, the request was denied. Parole boards cited a lack of consistent remorse, concerns about accountability, and unresolved issues surrounding her mental health. At various hearings, she alternated between expressions of regret and claims that her upbringing was to blame. Officials remained unconvinced that she posed no risk to society. And so, year after year, she stayed behind bars. The victims' families moved forward without the people they lost. The principal and custodian were remembered as heroes, who ran toward danger to protect children. Their names became symbols of courage in the face of senseless violence. Brenda Spencer grew older in prison. The teenager who once looked out a window at a playground became a woman who watched the world through bars. Decades passed. The country changed.
School shootings, once unthinkable, became horrifyingly familiar. But her case never faded. It resurfaced whenever discussions about gun access, youth violence, and mental health emerged. It stood as an early warning, a moment when society could have asked harder questions and built better safeguards. Instead, it became the first chapter in a long, painful pattern. Brenda remains incarcerated in California. Now in her 60s, she is still serving her life sentence. She remains eligible for parole, but each hearing carries the same weight as the last. For the families of the victims, time has not softened the loss. For the survivors, the memory is permanent. And for the rest of the country, her story remains a reminder that violence doesn't always announce its intentions. Sometimes it hides behind closed doors. Sometimes it looks like neglect. Sometimes it's handed a rifle and ignored. The warning signs are loud only in hindsight. This chapter isn't about repeating a phrase that made headlines. It's about understanding what happens when a teenager is isolated, armed, and unseen. Brenda Spencer didn't act out of passion or panic. She acted out of emptiness. And emptiness, when combined with access to lethal force, can be catastrophic. Next, we turn to one of the youngest murder convictions in American history. Two siblings, barely teenagers, a household steeped in fear, and a decision they believed was the only way out. Next chapter, Catherine and Curtis Jones, children who grew up behind bars. Chapter 7. Catherine and Curtis Jones. When police cars pulled into the driveway that January morning, no one expected to see children come out in handcuffs. Not suspects who looked like adults, not teenagers on the edge of adulthood. Children, barely tall enough to see over a courtroom railing. Because this case wasn't just about murder. It was about what happens when childhood collapses under pressure no one intervenes in time. Catherine and Curtis Jones were siblings, 12 and 13 years old, living in Brevard County, Florida. At that age, most kids are worried about grades, friends, and whether they'll be allowed to stay up late. Catherine should have been thinking about middle school dances. Curtis should have been focused on baseball cards or video games. Instead, they were thinking about survival. Their home life was unstable long before it became violent. Later accounts painted a picture of a household filled with fear, tension, and silence. Their father was strict. Their stepmother, Sonia, was described as controlling and distant. Catherine would later say that she and her brother felt trapped, ignored when they tried to ask for help, dismissed when they showed signs of distress. Teachers notice things that, in hindsight, feel impossible to ignore. Withdrawn behavior, long absences, a sense that something wasn't right. But nothing reached the level that forced intervention, and so the children stayed where they were. Over time, fear turned into desperation. In their young minds, the world narrowed. They believed no adult would listen, no system would step in, no escape existed. And when children reach that point, when they believe every door is closed, they don't think like adults. They think in absolutes. Catherine and Curtis began talking to each other about what they believed was the only solution. Not running away, not calling authorities, not telling a teacher. Ending the problem permanently. Their focus turned toward their stepmother. On January 6, 1999, while their father was away, that plan became reality. Curtis accessed a firearm inside the home. Catherine was present. Sonia was shot and killed. Afterward, the children ran. They fled into nearby woods, frightened and disoriented, with no plan beyond getting away from the scene. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what would happen next. They only knew that nothing could ever be the same. When authorities found them, the shock rippled across the country. 2 children charged with murder. News cameras captured images that felt unreal. Young faces framed by adult criminal charges. Reporters struggled to describe what they were seeing. The public struggled to understand how kids this young could be involved in something so final. When children commit violence, the failure came earlier. The legal system now faced a question it wasn't designed to answer. Should Catherine and Curtis be treated as children in crisis or criminals responsible for taking a life? Prosecutors chose to charge them as adults. The decision ignited immediate controversy. Advocates argued that children barely in their teens could not fully grasp the consequences of their actions, that their brains were undeveloped, that their behavior reflected trauma, not malice. Others argued that a life had been taken, and that age could not erase that reality. The courtroom became a battleground between empathy and accountability. In the end, the case never went to trial. Both siblings accepted plea deals. They pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The sentence? 18 years in prison, followed by lifetime probation. For Catherine and Curtis, this meant something almost unthinkable. They would grow up behind bars. Adolescence would happen in a correctional facility. Adulthood would arrive under constant supervision. Their childhood ended in a courtroom. Prison is not built for children. Inside, they had to learn quickly how to survive, how to keep quiet, how to navigate a world filled with adults who had lived very different lives. Over the years, both siblings attempted to build something resembling stability. They earned educational certificates. They participated in programs designed for rehabilitation. They matured in an environment that punished vulnerability. Catherine, in particular, became a focal point for juvenile justice reform discussions. Advocates pointed to her case as evidence that the system often responds too late, punishing outcomes instead of preventing them. Curtis followed a similar path, growing into adulthood under constant structure and surveillance. By the time they were released in 2015, they were no longer children. They were adults stepping into a world that had changed dramatically since 1999. Technology had advanced, social norms had shifted. The life they left behind no longer existed. Freedom, in their case, came with conditions. They were barred from contacting each other without special permission. They were placed under strict probation. Every aspect of their lives was monitored. They expressed remorse. They acknowledged the harm caused. They spoke about wanting quiet, ordinary lives, jobs, stability, anonymity. But their names would never fully fade. They remain etched in legal history as some of the youngest people ever convicted of murder in the United States. And their case left behind questions that still haven't been answered. If their claims of mistreatment had been addressed earlier, would Sonia still be alive? If teachers or authorities had intervened sooner, could the violence have been prevented? At what point does society stop seeing warning signs as phases and start seeing them as alarms? This story is uncomfortable because it doesn't offer a villain you can easily hate. It offers children who believe they had no way out. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it forces us to look at the space between victim and perpetrator and acknowledge that sometimes they overlap in disturbing ways. Justice feels different when everyone loses. The death of Sonia Jones was real, permanent. A life ended violently. But the collapse of Catherine and Curtis's childhoods was also real. Two things can be true at the same time. And that's why this case continues to surface in discussions about juvenile sentencing, trauma-informed justice, and the limits of punishment. Because locking children away answers one question, but leaves many others unanswered. Next, we move to a case driven not by fear or belief, but by forbidden love and manipulation. A teenage girl, an older boyfriend, and a mother who tried to stop it. The result would shock the nation. Next chapter, Tyler Witt and the crime that began with defiance and ended in blood. Chapter 8, Tyler Witt. At first glance, it looked like a familiar story. A teenager pushing back against rules, a parent trying to protect their child, arguments that felt intense but not unusual. The kind of conflict that plays out in thousands of homes every year. But in this house, that tension didn't cool with time. It sharpened, until someone decided there was only one way forward. Tyler Witt was 14 years old, living in El Dorado Hills, California. She was creative, musically inclined, and intelligent. Friends described her as expressive and emotional, someone who felt things deeply and didn't hide it. Her mother, Joanne, was a single parent, a respected software engineer who worked hard to provide stability. From the outside, it looked like a strong household. Inside, however, a fault line had formed. Tyler had begun dating a 19-year-old man named Stephen Culver. To Tyler, the relationship felt validating, intense, all-consuming in the way teenage love often is. Stephen paid attention to her, listened to her, made her feel understood at an age where many teens feel invisible. To Joanne, it looked dangerous. The age gap alone raised alarms. Joanne believed her daughter was being manipulated, drawn into something unhealthy. She confronted the situation head-on, setting boundaries, restricting contact, and eventually reporting Stephen to authorities. Charges were being prepared. And in that moment, the relationship stopped being a secret romance. It became a threat. To Tyler, her mother's actions felt like betrayal. She didn't see protection, she saw control. She believed Joanne was standing between her and the future she wanted. That belief hardened into resentment. Text messages and journal entries later revealed how deeply Tyler had turned against her mother. Her writing painted Joanne not as a parent enforcing rules, but as an obstacle that needed to be removed. And Stephen reinforced that thinking. Together, they began talking about life without Joanne. At first, it sounded like fantasy. What-if conversations fueled by teenage defiance and forbidden love. But over time, the tone changed. The ideas became darker, more specific, more final. On the night of June 12, 2009, Joanne went to bed unaware that her role as a mother had placed her in mortal danger. Later that night, Stephen entered her room. Joanne Witt was killed in her own home. Tyler did not physically carry out the act, but investigators would later determine that she was complicit. She had discussed the plan. She had encouraged the outcome. She had believed that removing her mother was the only way to continue the relationship. The next morning, Joanne didn't show up for work. Concerned colleagues contacted authorities. Police went to her home and made the discovery that would shake the community. Almost immediately, attention turned toward Tyler and Stephen. They were gone. The two were found the following day at a hotel near San Francisco. When taken into custody, the reality of what had happened became unavoidable. A 14-year-old girl had helped orchestrate her mother's murder. Love becomes dangerous when it demands destruction. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Many struggled to see Tyler as anything other than a cold, selfish teenager who chose a boyfriend over her own mother's life. Headlines emphasized betrayal. Commentators questioned her lack of remorse. Others saw something different. They saw a young girl caught in an emotionally manipulative relationship, too immature to understand how far things had gone until it was too late. The truth, as always, was more complicated. The legal process reflected that complexity. Because of her age, Tyler could not be tried in the same way as an adult murderer. But prosecutors also refused to treat her as a misguided child with no agency. She accepted a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Stephen Culver, Tyler pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Her testimony detailed the emotional dependency, the conversations about removing Joanne, and the distorted thinking that led her to believe this was the only solution. Stephen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tyler's sentence was different, but still devastating. 15 years to life. At just 16 years old, she entered the California prison system. Her teenage years ended the day she was transferred into custody. Prison stripped away the drama of forbidden love and replaced it with routine, isolation, and consequence. Whatever identity Tyler had built around the relationship with Stephen disappeared behind bars. She grew up there. Milestones passed unnoticed. Birthdays, graduations, ordinary moments that define adolescence happened without her. Over time, Tyler became eligible for parole hearings. Each one reopened the same wounds.
Joanne's friends and family consistently opposed her release, arguing that the severity of the crime could never be outweighed by rehabilitation. They spoke of Joanne as a woman who had done nothing more than try to protect her child, and paid for it with her life.